It's recording to the cloud. I hope that's okay.
That's fine.
Okay.
That's fine. Okay. Thank you very, very much. Okay. So I am going to introduce Jeff. And we've got this on recording. And let's see. Have I still got Zoom here? I hope so. Okay. Jeff belongs to the Timber, Fish, and Wildlife, which is called TFW, and he works with the Yakama Nation. He has degrees from both the College of Environmental Science and Forestry in Syracuse, where he got a BS in Environmental Forest Biology. He has an MS degree in Wildlife Science from Texas Tech University in Lubbock, Texas. This was a surprise to me because I went to Texas Tech and graduated with a degree in music in 1970. I asked him about Lubbock, and he says the university is great, but Lubbock still has red dirt. No kidding. He studied the use of the Chihuahuan Desert arroyos and adjacent uplands by migrant and breeding birds in New Mexico while he was at Tech. He worked for the past 20 years with Yakama, researching and studying sage grouse, raptors, and non-game birds. He restores seeps, springs, and riparian areas, plus studying the ecology of white-headed woodpeckers and other cavity nesting birds. He is author of Birds of the World section on white-headed woodpecker. He reviews timber sales on the ceded lands of the Yakama Nation to help protect habitat important to state and federally listed wildlife. He's a pretty impressive guy. I really enjoyed meeting him and talking to him. And please welcome Jeff Kozma.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much, Patty. I appreciate that warm welcome. I appreciate Whidbey Audubon inviting me to speak tonight. As Patty mentioned, I'm going to be talking about all 12 of Washington's woodpecker species. So I will share my screen. Just give me 1 minute here. And let's see. Just want to make sure I'm sharing the sound, which I am. All right. Okay, so can you see that, Patty? Is that good? All right.
We can see it. Go for it.
All right. So I'm going to talk tonight about getting to know Washington's woodpeckers. First, I want to start out. Let's see. Can you see a bar across the top, or is that hidden on your view, Patty?
What kind of a bar?
Like where it says mute, stop video. Can you see that or no?
No.
Okay, good. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about woodpeckers and what makes them so unique among our birds. Well, first, they have a very heavy and chisel-like beak that they use for excavating into wood for creating their nest cavities and also for foraging for food. They have a short neck and a stocky body that enables them to get force and into hitting a tree in order to excavate through the wood. So having that really compact, stocky structure allows them to input force better into wood. And they have zygodactyl feet, which is probably one of their most unique characteristics. And what that means is they have 2 toes pointing forward and 2 toes pointing backwards. And this differs from, like, say, our passerines, like the American robin, sparrows, where they have 3 toes facing forward and 1 toe facing back. And that zygodactyl arrangement of their feet allows them to grab onto the bark and also provides greater stability when they're excavating into wood. They have stiff tails that act like a prop, and those feathers are noticeably stiffer than all the other feathers on their body. And that allows them to prop their body weight onto their tail when they're excavating into wood. And they have long, often barbed tongues, and those barbs are located at the very tip of the tongue, and they're usually pointing backwards towards the bird. And so what they do is they don't actually use their tongue to spear insects beneath the wood or beneath the bark, but they use it to put their tongue between the insect and the wood. And when they retract their tongue back to their bill, those reverse barbs help move the wood-boring grubs and other larva, insect larva that's found deep in the bark closer to their bill, in which they are able to pull it out from the wood. So they don't actually spear the insect larva, because if they did, they wouldn't be able to get it off their tongue. So they use it as a way to maneuver those grubs out of the wood and get it closer to their bill so they can pull them out of the wood. And a couple of our woodpeckers actually don't have barbed tongues. Like the northern flicker has a very smooth, sticky tongue, and sapsuckers actually have brush-like appendages at the tip of their tongue used for drinking sap. They have all the woodpeckers have feathers that cover the nares or the nostrils, and this prevents wood and wood shavings and dust from getting in there when they're excavating into wood. And they also have an undulating flight. And so the best way I could figure to describe that would be to show you a picture. So here we have two birds. The bird in the upper up top, it would be something like a goldfinch. And many of you have probably noticed that they have this flight where it's kind of a bounding up and down flight, where at the very top of their flight pattern, they kind of tuck their wings in, and then when they start to drop, they flap, 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 and come up again to the top, and then drop, flap, flap, flap. This is what they call undulating. And with woodpeckers, they have the exact same kind of flight. And as I'll show you in a minute, this could be an adaptation for allowing them to land on vertical surfaces. They also have a very unique flight and wing shape, as I mentioned, the undulating flight, but their wings are and the feathers are actually relatively broad. And what this does is enables them to maneuver through the canopies of trees, maneuver around trunks when they're avoiding predators, kind of like how the accipiter hawks have short, broad, rounded wings, which make them more maneuverable for moving through vegetation. Also the same thing with woodpeckers. But these broad wings also help them stop more abruptly when they're coming up to a vertical surface to land. And you can see here in this picture of this pileated woodpecker where it has its tail flared and it has its wings completely outstretched. That's a really good way for them to kind of hit the brakes in midair and allow them to land vertically on a trunk. And if you've ever watched a woodpecker when it's doing this undulating flight up and down, they usually plan it and with their flight mechanics that when they're on their uprise of that undulation is when they're approaching a tree trunk, so that the tree would be here in the undulating flight and the bird comes up and it's like, boom, it's already vertical and can land on a tree. So kind of unique among some of our other birds. They also climb primarily up trees and also on branches and hang upside down on branches. They can go backwards down a tree, but it's usually tail first. And so it's kind of comical to watch, but they'll be backing down a tree. And as they back down, they have to lift their tail up in order to kind of scooch down the tree. So it's kind of this lift the tail, drop, lift the tail, drop. Unlike the nuthatches that can just kind of walk all over the tree trunks, woodpeckers either back down or go straight up. They can't go upside down on a vertical surface. And probably one of the more unique features of woodpeckers is that they drum instead of sing. Now I have an asterisk for sing because flickers are kind of one of the exceptions where they have a very long broadcasting and loud call that they make. Most of our other woodpeckers, the way they announce their territory, the way they defend territories, and the way they attract mates over long distances is to drum. And so as a wildlife biologist and a birder, I've had many, many people come up to me and say, how can I keep this woodpecker from drumming on my house or beating on my gutters? It's so loud. Well, they do this to advertise because most of them cannot sing and they don't have a loud voice. So what they do is they wrap their beak very, very fast against a hard resonant surface, which is usually a dead tree or a dead tree branch. But they've come to find out that metal works really, really well. And they don't hurt themselves on it because they're just wrapping it really, really, really fast. They're not trying to drill into the metal. But this is, for those who haven't heard it, this is what it sounds like. And this is a hairy woodpecker drumming. So there's an example of a drumming. And this is most frequently done in early spring through about the middle of the breeding season. And then usually once they have chicks and they're feeding nestlings, the drumming really peters off. They don't really drum very much, but it's most frequently heard usually in March and April, because that's when they're trying to defend their territory. The hormones are starting to flow, and they want to get the word out that this territory is occupied or that they need to attract a mate. And usually both males and females drum. So woodpeckers are often referred to as forest engineers. So all of them excavate a cavity in a dead or living tree. And I have a little asterisk there because living trees are very rare that they can excavate into. And most of the time it's aspen trees, because the aspen tree, the tree can still be very much alive, but it can have the heart of it rotted out from different types of wood decaying fungi. And so the woodpeckers have to excavate through the live outer wood into the dead heartwood. So aspens are very popular, but it's one of the only trees in our area that usually woodpeckers can excavate into through live tissue. So most of the time they're excavating into dead trees, or what we call snags. And males do most of the excavation. It's thought that females select the site, but males do excavate more frequently. And I've studied white-headed woodpeckers, conducted field research on them for the last 20 years. And almost all the time when I'm observing them excavating, it's the male that's doing the work. The female will come in, she'll excavate a little bit. Usually she'll look in the cavity, and I think she's basically performing an inspection service to see how well the cavity is coming along. But males do most of the excavating. And excavating a cavity can take anywhere from a few days to a week or more. So it can be a long involved process. And it's one of the reasons why woodpeckers only have one nesting or one brood of chicks per year, because they usually will not reuse a cavity. So if the first nest fails, then they have to excavate a new cavity in order to nest most of the time. And so usually there's not enough time in a year to do that. So for most woodpeckers, it's a one and done nesting event. And when they excavate the cavity and it's finished, they don't build a nest inside that cavity, but instead they lay their eggs on a bed of wood chips that they leave at the bottom of the cavity. So when they're done excavating the cavity, the last few wood chips, and they'll actually carve and create bigger wood chips in the bottom for them to lay the eggs on. And this photo here is a picture inside a white-headed woodpecker nest, one of the ones that I monitored. And you can see there's one egg that didn't hatch there, but there's two chicks that are a couple days old, and you can kind of see the wood chips on the bottom. And as those chicks develop and they poop in the cavity, the adults remove the fecal material, usually with a bunch of wood chips. So those wood chips are replenished over time as the chicks grow and develop. So both adults incubate the eggs when they're in the cavity. Males only do this at night. Well, I should say males alternate with females during the day incubating, and males are always the ones in the cavity at night incubating the eggs. And both adults feed the nestlings and clean the cavity. But males do most of the, from what I found, at least for hairy and white-headed woodpeckers, is that males do most of the sanitization of the cavity, removing most of the fecal material. And both adults brood the chicks during the day. So up until the chicks are about 10 days old, when they start to develop pin feathers, they cannot thermoregulate themselves yet. They can't control their own body heat. So the adults have to brood them and keep them warm. And so the male and female alternate that when the chicks are young during the day. But like incubation, the males are the only ones that brood the chicks at night. So overall, males do a disproportionate amount of the work with the nesting process. They excavate most of the cavity. They do more of the incubation because they're in there all night long. They do more of the cavity cleaning and keeping the nest clean. And they also brood the chicks more than the females do because they're in there all night long as well. So I always say woodpeckers make good dads. Both adults do feed the fledglings, and the fledglings can stay dependent on the adults anywhere from about 2 to 4 weeks. So it's a longer developmental period because it takes a while for them to learn how to forage and how to get their own food, and basically how to be a woodpecker. So as you can see, it's a longer nesting process, which is why they usually only have one brood per year. So here's a little video I took. This is up on Bethel Ridge here in Yakama County at about 5,000 feet. It's an old forest burn, and it's a male hairy woodpecker that is feeding its chicks. And you should be able to hear the chicks begging when I play the video. It's a short video. You can see how the chicks were right up there at the cavity entrance. So these nestlings were about probably within 3 to 5 days of fledging. That's usually when they're able to get up to the hole to beg for food, and the adults no longer have to go into the nest to feed them. Anyway, so I just thought that'd be kind of cool to show that the woodpecker chicks can be pretty loud, and that's actually how I found the nest, was from their begging calls. Okay, so woodpeckers in Washington. Washington has 12 of the 22 species of woodpeckers and sapsuckers in the United States. So just over half of the species can be found right here. There's a greater diversity of woodpeckers east of the Cascade Crest than there is on the west side. And this is due to a diversity of elevation and forest types. For instance, over here, we have everything from oak savannas to dry ponderosa pine forest to mixed conifer all the way up to subalpine. So it's that those varying degrees of habitat which allow more woodpecker species to coexist here on the eastern slope of the Cascades than on the west side. Yakama and Klickitat counties are the hotspots where all 12 species can be seen there. We know acorn woodpeckers, I believe, breed in Klickitat County, and we do have them show up here in Yakama County, usually at Fort Simcoe, where there's a lot of oak trees. But so far, we haven't confirmed breeding yet in Yakama County. But you can usually find all 12 species here. Okay, so before I go into the downy woodpecker and to describing and going over the characteristics of all the species, does anybody have any questions about stuff I've already covered? We'll see if we have any questions.
I guess they're being mum's the word.
Okay, and I don't see, is there anything in the chat? Let's see.
Nope, nothing in the chat.
Okay, sounds good. Well, I will continue then.
You're doing a super job.
Oh, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to start out with the downy woodpecker. It is, let's see here.
There is a question that just popped up.
Oh, yes, go ahead. You can read it.
Where do females go at night?
I'm sorry, what was that?
Where do females go at night? If the males are doing the brooding, where do they go?
Okay, so if the male is in the cavity at night, either incubating or brooding the chicks, the female usually will roost in a separate cavity, and they usually have multiple roost cavities that they use throughout the year, and that's usually where the female will go when the male is in the cavity at night during the nesting season. Okay. So the downy woodpecker is our only small woodpecker to be found commonly in lowland areas, and it's also our most common urban woodpecker. And they like deciduous trees and riparian areas. They aren't usually found in pure conifer forest like the other woodpecker species here. So like here on the east side of the Cascades, where I'm most familiar, this bird is usually a bird of riparian areas up in the mountains. And the only time I've seen them really in pure conifer forest is where there's been some sort of disturbance, like a forest fire or a prescribed burn, where there's some dead trees that the downies are foraging on for insects. They're also the most common species to frequent feeders where trees are present. And I say where trees are present because there's a lot of areas over here where we don't have trees. So, so they're our most common woodpecker, the one you're most likely to see at your suet feeder. And I'll just play a couple of vocalizations. This is the common contact call you hear, or the real high pitched peak call. Play that one first. Let's play that one more time since it's short. So that's the common call you hear a downy woodpecker make, usually when they're foraging or just moving through the forest or trying to stay in contact with their mate. And then this is what we call the rattle call. This is usually a territorial call, or usually an agitation call that they make when there's an intruder in their territory. And I've often heard this referred to as the whinny call because it kind of sounds like a whinnying horse. I'll play that again, but you can tell the really high-pitched nature of their vocalization. And they kind of sound like squeaky toys, kind of, to me. Okay, so how do we tell a downy woodpecker? Well, one of the easiest ways to tell is by the size of their bill. These guys have a really tiny little stubby bill, and it's usually much shorter than the width of the head is long. So you can see these two yellow bars here, the length of the bill on the right being very small, and then you have the length of the head being much, much larger. So when the bill is smaller than the width of the head, that's a good indication it's a downy woodpecker. Another good indication is that they have 2 white outer tail feathers out on each side of their body, with all the other ones being jet black. And those two white outer tail feathers usually have a few black spots on them. And so that's another identifying feature for a downy woodpecker. They have what I call a 6-stripe head pattern. So it goes black on top, and then it goes black, white, black, white, black, white. So it's kind of like 3 stripes of black and 3 stripes of white when you look at them from the side. The males have a red spot on the back of their head. This is often referred to as the nuchal patch, the Nuchal. But I usually just call it a red nape spot. It's usually not divided through the middle, so it's usually solid red. There's no black line. And females don't have that, so that's how you can tell a male from female. They have an all white underbelly and white on the side, so there's no barring, there's no gray, no nothing. They're just pure white. They have jet black wings with a lot of white spots, and those are on almost all of the primary flight feathers and the coverts up above. And so they're usually fairly visible on the bird when they're perched or when they're climbing around. And they have this very broad white stripe down the middle of their black back. And downy woodpecker gets the name because apparently those feathers are really, really soft compared to the hairy woodpecker, where those feathers are more rough, and they feel more like hairs than feathers. Now, I've banded both of these species, and every time I do it, I forget to actually check and see and like actually physically pet their back feathers to see if that holds true. So the next time I catch either one of these, I'm going to have to do that. Okay, so now the larger version of a downy woodpecker would be the hairy woodpecker. So they're our most common woodpecker in conifer forest across almost all of Washington. So if you're hiking through anywhere from ponderosa pine to just below subalpine forest, the most common woodpecker you're going to come across is going to be the hairy woodpecker. They can be very abundant in forest burn areas or areas where there's been mixed severity fires. And the reason for that is because they're capitalizing on the insects that are attracted to the dead trees. And also those dead trees provide substrates in which for them to excavate a nest cavity. And these guys, being bigger than downies, you can often hear them foraging and pecking into wood for insects. These guys are relatively strong excavators, so they can dig pretty far into wood looking for wood-boring grubs. And I'll play their vocalizations, and you can the way I describe them is they're just louder and more emphatic than a downy woodpecker's kind of squeaky toy sounds. So you can hear this is the peak call of a hairy. And then I'll play their rattle call, which it doesn't sound like a little whinnying horse. These guys are a lot louder. It's kind of a drier rattle sound. And like the downy woodpecker, that call is usually used during territorial encounters between 2 males or 2 females, or when the birds are highly agitated, they'll often give that rattle call. Okay, so as I described for the downy woodpecker, their bill is much smaller than the width of their head. But in a hairy woodpecker, the length of the bill is almost as long as the length of the head is wide. And you can see that here. So that's kind of a really good way when you're just looking at a bird and you don't have that size comparison where a downy woodpecker is about half the size of a hairy woodpecker. You can tell by the length of the bill pretty well that whether it's a hairy or a downy. And as I mentioned, the downy woodpecker has black spots on the white outer tail feathers, and on a hairy woodpecker, those tail feathers are pure white, so they won't have those black spots. Like the downy, the males have a red patch on the back of their head, and on a hairy woodpecker, it's often divided by black feathering, so it looks like there's two spots on the back of the head instead of one solid red spot. They have the same white underbelly and unmarked sides of a downy woodpecker. And they also have that same white stripe down the back of their black back. Now, interesting thing, and I've seen this reported multiple times for hairy, and I've picked it up as a good ID feature, is they'll often have this kind of black spur on the left-hand bird here, left photo. You can see that red arrow that come up is pointing to a black spur that kind of comes over the bend of the wing. And you can see it on this bird. Hopefully you can see my cursor. You can see it on the male on the right too, coming just down into his breast. And that's usually lacking in a downy woodpecker. And they have the same white spots throughout the primary flight feathers that the downies do. And it's also in some of the wing coverts as well. And that white spotting can vary. Birds on the west side of the mountains, both downies and hairies, the white spotting is much more reduced, and it can be brighter the further east you go into Washington and into the Rockies, where those white spots become a lot more prominent. Okay, so what I like to call is the hairy downy woodpecker conundrum. So how do these two species evolve evolve to look so much like one another? So why do they look alike? Well, interestingly enough, they are not closely related genetically. The hairy woodpecker is more closely related to the white-headed woodpecker and the Arizona woodpecker, actually. So their two closest relatives don't even look anything like a downy woodpecker. So if they're not related genetically, why do they share the same plumage? Well, this is what we call a case of plumage convergence, where two species that are not closely related have evolved over time to develop plumage characteristics that resemble one another. So you might say, well, why would two bird species do that? Why would they evolve to look like one another? What would be the advantages of that? Well, the hairy woodpecker, compared to the downy woodpecker, is a much more aggressive species, and it's larger. So it can often displace other woodpeckers from feeding spots that are its size or smaller. And at feeders, for instance, a hairy woodpecker will often chase off other species that are smaller than itself because they're just that much more aggressive. So what researchers now think is that downy woodpeckers evolved to look like the hairy woodpecker in order to avoid aggression if you look like the aggressor. So for a downy woodpecker to look like a much more aggressive hairy woodpecker would be advantageous to the downy because it would not be picked on, or maybe it can capitalize on food resources because other birds will think it's a hairy woodpecker coming in to basically compete for those food resources. So basically, it helps to look like an aggressive bully if you're a downy woodpecker. So that's kind of the thinking now about how these two species evolved to look very similar to one another. It's called plumage convergence, and they think it's because downies resemble the much more larger and aggressive hairy woodpecker. So kind of interesting. Okay, so let's move on to the white-headed woodpecker. This is my favorite. I'm not biased or anything, just because I've been studying them for so long. But this species is rather habitat specific. It's found only where ponderosa pine is the dominant tree species. And that's usually between 2,200 and 4,000 foot elevation here on the east slope of the Cascades. You cannot find them on the west side. They do not breed over there. So they're an east side species. And the reason for their being tied to ponderosa pine is because they rely on ponderosa pine seed and also ponderosa pine sap as part of their food throughout the year. So they're really tied to this one pine species here in Washington. They also, of course, eat insects that are associated with ponderosa pine. This species is quiet most of the year, even when foraging. They tend to kind of flake bark. They aren't really known for excavating deeply into wood and making a lot of noise. They kind of peer underneath the bark scales. They flake bark off, so they're a rather quiet foraging species. And outside the breeding season, they're really not too vocal, so they can be really hard to find, even if birders say know a particular area where the species is found. A lot of people still have trouble locating them. These guys have large territories, usually greater than 100 acres or so in size, and that can also make them hard to find. So here I'll play some vocalizations. Whereas the downy and the hairy have a single kind of peak call, the white-headed woodpecker has a multiple syllable call. It's usually referred to as pidik or pidink or pididik. So you can see very different from the hairies or the downy woodpeckers. And this is an example of their rattle call. It sounds very similar to a hairy's. And there is kind of a hairy peak call mixed in there when whoever recorded the audio must have got both species together. But you can tell the rattle call there for a whitehead. I'll play that one more time. Okay, so let's talk about some plumage characteristics. So as their name suggests, they have an all white head. Actually, it's more of a white face, and the top of their head is white. The back of their head is black along the nape. And the males have the same red spot that hairies and downies have, but unlike the hairy, the red spot does not have a black dividing line down the middle of it. It's always a solid red across. The rest of their body is basically a pattern of black and white. They have an all black back, an all black belly, an all black tail, and the only white outside of their head is located in their primary feathers, which can be seen when the birds are perched on the trees like here, but sometimes it can be hidden. But in flight, that big white patch is very noticeable when the birds are in flight. So as I mentioned, these guys feed on sap, and they actually drill their own sap wells in ponderosa pine. And here's an example of some freshly drilled sap wells. You can see the sap oozing on that. That's a picture I took this spring out in my study area in the Weenass, the Weenass Valley, just west of Yakama. And here's some older newer sap wells among older sap wells in a much larger ponderosa pine. So you can see that they use the same trees over a period of years, with the much older holes being almost completely covered over by the tree, and the new holes drilled in between where the old wells were. And you can actually see some pine sap dripping there as well. And these look much different than a sapsucker's wells that they drill for mining sap. Those are usually in a grid pattern with usually little squares cut out for the sap to ooze. And white-headed woodpeckers' sap wells are always drilled in horizontal rows. They're usually about 2 or 3 inches apart. And most of the time they're on the southeast facing side of the tree. And the reason for that is because here in the Northern Hemisphere, during the wintertime and into spring, the sun is lower in the southern sky. And so it heats up the southeast or the southern side of pine trees, which allows the sap to flow earlier in the springtime. And these birds feed on tree sap only from about March until they start nesting around the first week of May or middle of May, somewhere around there. Usually once the nesting season starts, they stop eating sap and they switch entirely to insects. So something that's kind of interesting about their biology. Okay, so here's another one of my favorites is the black-backed woodpecker. And this, as I'm sure some of you know, is a burned forest specialist. So this species really attains its highest population densities in areas where forest fires have occurred. So they're uniquely adapted for foraging and for living and reproducing in burned forests. Sometimes those forests can be completely charred where there's no live trees at all. Excuse me. And they have very distinctive calls, which don't sound anything like the other woodpeckers we've heard so far. So I'll play those. This is their kind of their pick call, which is kind of like the hairy and the downy's peak call, or the white-headed padick, multiple padick or padink call. So I'll play that first. So to me, it actually almost sounds kind of insect-like or kind of like a small mammal, like a squirrel call. Doesn't really even sound bird-like to me. And now I'll play their version of the rattle call or the whinny call of like what a downy would have. And it's kind of a very unique call. I'll just put it that way. So very distinctive calls. If you hear any of those in burned forest, that's when you start trekking through and looking for the black-backed woodpecker. Okay, so as their name suggests, they have an all-black back, kind of like what a white-headed woodpecker looks like with the jet black back. On the sides of their body, instead of being pure white like a downy or a hairy, they have kind of these blackish and gray bars amongst kind of gray, black, and white barring on the side, which is very unique. And unlike the other species that we've talked about, these guys only have 3 toes. So somewhere in evolution, they lost one. So they have 2 toes pointing forward and only 1 toe pointing back. And it's believed that this arrangement is an adaptation for even stronger excavating abilities because it allows their toes to spread out further and create almost like a triangle pattern, which is a little bit more stable and gives them a little bit more anchoring power. The males have a bright yellow lemon spot on the very top of their forehead, which is very unique. The females don't have that. The top of their head is jet black. They have the same kind of white spotting along their primary flight feathers and a little bit into the secondaries that the hairy and downy does, but it's much more reduced. So it just looks more black overall. And now we'll move on to the other burned forest specialist, the American three-toed woodpecker. And again, as the name implies, has 3 toes. So these guys are also common in burned conifer forest, but you can also find them in forests that have been hit by insect outbreaks. For instance, by mountain pine beetle and lodgepole pine forest, or ponderosa pine beetle and ponderosa forest. They don't have to be found entirely in burned forest. So they can be found in areas where insects have caused a large number of trees to die. The calls are similar to both the downy and the hairy woodpecker, and I'll play those in a minute. And they tend to flake the bark and also dig, so they can be a loud forager as well. If they're in an area and they're foraging for insects, you can usually hear them. And these guys are found at a little bit higher elevation than the black-backed woodpecker, so they're usually above 4,000 foot elevation, compared to the black-backed woodpecker, which can be found actually as low all the way down into ponderosa pine forest at about 2,000 foot elevation where fires have occurred. You usually won't find American three-toads down that low in elevation. Okay, so I'll play their contact call for you. So it sounds a lot more similar to a hairy or a downy woodpecker than to either the white-headed or the black-backed. And this is an example of their rattle call. Again, sounds closer to a hairy woodpecker than it does to a black-backed. So like the black-backed woodpecker, the males also have a spot of yellow on the very top of their head, but it's usually not as bright lemon yellow as it is on a black-backed woodpecker. And as their name suggests, as I mentioned earlier, they also have three toes, two pointing towards the front and one usually pointing to the back or off to the side. They have a white stripe down the back of their black back, but that white stripe also sometimes has little tiny black feathers in it, so it kind of gives more of a mottled appearance. So it's usually not as pure white as in a downy or a hairy. And they have a kind of the same facial pattern as a downy woodpecker, where they have the black, white, and black. Whereas in a black-backed woodpecker, that upper white stripe there is missing. They have the same kind of barring and on the side, but it's not as extensive as in a black-backed woodpecker. So they have more of a white belly with kind of just black flecks below their wing along their flank. And their bill is kind of what I kind of consider a wedge shaped. It's a little bit shorter and stouter than on a black-backed woodpecker. And you can see it's almost kind of triangular, where it gets much broader and wider towards the face of the woodpecker than at the bill. So kind of a unique shape compared to the other species that we've seen so far.
Jeff, there's
Yes.
a question, which of the three-toed woodpeckers might be found in Malheur?
Oh, I'm not very familiar with Malheur in Oregon. Not sure what the elevation is there, but I would think blackback would be more common than the American three-toed. That's just my guess. I'm not really positive though.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay, and also, so like the downy and the hairy woodpecker, and the blackback, they have the white spots along the primary flight feathers that are visible when the bird is perched, but they look more like just more like flecking than actual spots on a three-toed. So there's subtle differences between all the species and of these species that I've shown so far. So hopefully they're enough that you can discern them in the field, which I think they can be. So as I mentioned, the three-toed and some of the other species flake bark. So this is an example of a fire-killed tree where a lot of the bark has been flaked off. So you can see the kind of yellowish white inner bark where the black burned bark has been flaked off by the woodpeckers as they forage for insects. And here's an example of an insect-killed tree. This was killed by mountain pine beetles. It's a ponderosa pine. This is up kind of off Highway 97 between Ellensburg and Leavenworth. And you can see that those kind of really fine lines in there through that bark are all the insect or all the larval galleries from the pine beetles that have gone in there and killed the tree. So what happens is the adult beetles burrow through the tree, through the bark. They create a gallery in the cambium layer in which they lay their eggs. And when the eggs hatch, the larvae, the grubs basically, go out in vertical lines from that gallery, and they chew up through the cambium layer and eventually kill the tree so they're effectively girdling the tree. So the woodpeckers are going in there, they're finding these dead trees, and they're flaking that bark off to get to those insect galleries, illustrating how important woodpeckers are to the forest ecosystem and helping keep some of these insects that are detrimental to trees under control. Okay, so the pileated woodpecker or pileated woodpecker, I've heard it both ways, and I think I've actually looked it up, and I think both ways are acceptable. So however you say it is perfectly fine. I usually say pileated. So the pileated woodpecker, it is found in conifer forest and riparian deciduous forest as well. Its loud, resonant call carries very long distances, and I'll give you an example of that in a minute. This is often referred to as the woody woodpecker. It's believed that this is the woodpecker that the comic book character or the comic strip character Woody Woodpecker was modeled after. And despite their large size, these guys are our largest woodpecker in the United States, and they're about the size of a crow, to kind of give you a reference. Despite their size, they can be very secretive. And so I'll play two examples of their call. So that would be an example of their territorial advertisement call. It's sometimes also given between members of a pair calling to each other across the forest, but it's loud, it resonates, and it carries a really long way. Just play that one more time. So the only woodpecker that sounds similar to that is the northern flicker, which I'll get to in a minute. But there is a difference in the calls, and when we hear the flicker, you'll be able to hear the difference. And this is another call that the pileatids use. And that call can actually go on for a really, really long time. I think the sound file I had for that, the length that I played was only about a quarter of the total length of that sound file. So these birds can use that call, and it can go on for a very long time. And that's also a communication call that the birds use to announce territory and to communicate between the members of a pair. So the pileated woodpecker has a very well-defined red crest on top of its head. And on the male, which is on the left here, you can see that the red on the top of the head extends all the way to the base of the bill. But on a female, the red only extends to about where the eye starts. And so the whole front of the forehead on a female is jet black. So that's one way to tell the sexes apart. The other is that the males have a red malar stripe, which extends from the base of the bill across the cheek. And on the female, that malar stripe is black. Now, both sexes have the kind of white extending from the facial stripe all the way down the neck, which is kind of a unique characteristic for these guys. And it actually forms a little bit of a white spur across the just above where the wing bends. And they have a jet black body, essentially. Their wings, their back, and their tail are jet black. So just want to point that out, that they're all black except for the colorations on their head. And in flight, they do have a white wing patch, kind of like what the white-headed woodpecker does. But you really can't see that in the folded wing of the birds when they're perched on a tree. Okay, so this is what their excavations look like, and none of the other woodpeckers make such an extensive excavation for insects into wood. And this was a picture I took down in Klickitat County. This was a grand fir tree that had carpenter ants colony in it, which will often go into trees where the heart rot or where there's been rot in the center of the tree. And that's where the carpenter ants make their nests. Well, the carpenter ants are one of the pileated woodpecker's favorite foods. So they actually dig fairly deeply into trees looking for those ants. And here at the bottom of the tree, you can see the wood chip pile. So it kind of looks like somebody had taken a chainsaw to this tree, but it's actually, that's all the excavating work that the pileated woodpeckers have done. It's amazing how much wood they can excavate out of a tree looking for insects. And here's another example, different tree species. This would be a Douglas fir, where the center of that tree has been killed by a heart rot fungus, and carpenter ants, like in the grand fir to the left, carpenter ants have moved in there, and pileated woodpeckers have dug extensive, deep rectangular holes into the tree to get to the carpenter ant colonies. So very distinctive foraging excavations often indicate their presence when you don't see the birds. Okay, so as I mentioned, here we have the northern flicker. It's probably the only call that you would be confused with a pileated woodpecker, and I'll get to the calls in 1 second. So flickers are common in all forest types throughout Washington. They're one of probably our most common woodpecker species here. They're commonly seen on the ground foraging for ants. And as I mentioned before, they don't have a barbed tongue. They have a tongue that's more like an anteater. It's very, very long, and it allows them to stick that tongue down into the ground, into ant colonies. And it's very, very sticky, so ants stick to their tongue, and when they pull their tongue back up, they're able to swallow the ants that way. So kind of a unique adaptation. And as I said, ants make up most of their summer diet. These guys are migratory, so a lot of times they're breeding up in the Cascades or up in Canada, and those birds leave when temperatures get too cold. Here in the east slope of the Cascades, like in the Yakama Valley, we get a lot of flickers in the wintertime because of all our orchards and all the fruit that's laying on the ground that the birds will feed on when ants aren't available. And flickers, I like to say, are loud, flashy, and very easy to find. So there's flickers around most of the time. You'll either hear them or see them because they're foraging on the ground. They're usually pretty visible. So I'll play an example of their first call. This one's the most similar to the pileated woodpecker, but you can tell when I play it, it's a lot higher pitched call than what the pileated has. Oh, sorry. That's the second call. This is just their contact call. Often referred to as sounding like keer that they're saying. I'll play that one more time. Okay, so this next call is the one that sounds most like a pileated woodpecker. So it's a lot higher pitched and a lot longer in duration than the pileated call that I played earlier. And even though these guys have a more extensive vocal repertoire, like that call that you just heard will carry a long distance, they also still drum. And pileated woodpeckers also drum, even though they have a loud vocalization that carries a long distance. So drumming is still part of these birds' repertoire. And a lot of times you'll hear the flicker give that long kick, 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 kick call. And then right after that, it'll drum. And then it'll do the call, and then it'll drum. So oftentimes they're done in succession with each other. So these guys are uniquely patterned. Both the males and the females have kind of a gray face. The males have a red malar stripe, like the male pileated does, but the female flicker does not have a malar stripe. They have this kind of gray and black dotted back pattern, which is also present on the outside of the top part of the tail feathers. Both sexes have this black kind of crescent mark across their breast, which is probably, I think, one of their most distinguishing characteristics. And they also have this kind of buff belly with these black spotted pattern on it as well. And our flickers here in Washington and the Western United States are the red-shafted variety, you want to call it that. The variety that you see towards the Eastern United States is a yellow-shafted flicker. And where those two varieties overlap and interbreed, you can get all different kinds of color mixing and what we call intergrades. And we get a lot of intergrades here in the wintertime that I've seen, at least here on the east side of the Cascades. As I mentioned, we get a lot of flickers along the east slope of the Cascades in the orchards in the wintertime. So we get a lot here in the Yakama Valley because they're feeding on a lot of the fruit that's left over that's not picked. But they'll also feed on other fruit. Here's an example of a picture of a flicker in a mountain ash tree. But when there is no fruit, these birds actually will forage for insects in the bark of trees. So this is a video I took during last year's Christmas bird count. This was over in a little park called Randall Park here in Yakima. And this flicker, when I play the video, you can see him pull out two insects of some kind out from underneath the bark. And you can actually see him using his tongue to do that. So I'll play this video. There's one he just got and swallowed it. And he just pulled out the second one and swallowed it. So they're very adept at foraging on trees for insects. They just don't excavate deeply into the trees like other woodpeckers do for insects. They're more of a superficial forager.
A question.
Yes.
That said, do some drum to shake ants out of the trees? I was told that years ago.
No, that's not to my knowledge. I have not heard that, and I've not seen that in any of the papers that I've read. Drumming is simply done for announcing territory, defending a territory, attracting a mate. And I have actually seen them do that out of agitation. In my research, I've done a lot of nest monitoring. So I go up to nests and I stick a camera inside the cavities to count the chicks and the eggs and so forth in the nests. And sometimes I will have woodpeckers drum at me when I'm checking a cavity. So I think it's also can be like an agitation or a type of a displacement display where they drum. But I've not heard it tied anything to foraging for their insect prey. Okay, so here's we'll move on to the Lewis's woodpecker. This is another primarily east side species. I think I always called them our most unwoodpecker-like woodpecker because most of the time when they're foraging for insects, they fly catch. So they fly out into the air, they catch insects, they bring them back to a perch, and then they consume those insects. Which really none of the other woodpeckers do I mean, some of them then will fly catch for insects, but nothing to the extent that Lewis's woodpeckers do. They also eat acorns in the wintertime, and when acorns are absent and insects become scarce, these guys will partially migrate further south to areas where there's warmer or more food. And they're primarily found near oaks where they can nest in colonies, like here at Fort Simcoe. We can have sometimes 20 and 30 Lewis's woodpeckers there at any one time. You will find them in cottonwood groves, especially along riparian areas, in ponderosa pine forest, and also in burned forest. So they can occupy different habitat types, but their highest densities, I think, are usually associated with the Oregon white oak tree. And I'll play an example of their call, which to me is also very unwoodpecker-like. It's almost hard not to laugh when you hear them vocalizing. They're just so comical. Okay, so they're uniquely patterned. I don't think none of our other woodpeckers look anything like these guys. Both these sexes look alike. Males and females are identical. You can't tell them apart just visually. They both have this kind of bright red face with the back of their head is black. They have a bright pink, kind of pinkish white to pinkish red belly, which is very unique. They have this kind of gray collar, which wraps around their neck. Their back and their wings and the top of their tail are black, but they almost have this kind of greenish iridescent sheen to them when you can see them in really good light. And their bill is much stockier, I think, and almost a little bit curved compared to some of other woodpecker species. And this thicker bill might be an adaptation for fly catching because it enables them to grasp insects in the air a little bit easier. And as I mentioned, being unwoodpecker-like, even in flight, to me, they look like a crow. I mean, to me, this doesn't look, other than the spiked tail feathers that indicate it's a woodpecker. I mean, even their flight pattern when they're sailing around looking for insects, they look like crows. So one way to think about them is the most unwoodpecker woodpecker that looks like a crow when they're flying. So they're really unique birds. Okay, and then we have the acorn woodpecker, which occupies very similar habitat to the Lewis's, but they're primarily found only in oak forest or oak where there is some ponderosa pine. And here, as I mentioned earlier, in Yakama or in Washington, the hotspot for finding them would be in Klickitat County, near the Columbia Gorge. These guys are loud and aggressive, kind of like the Lewis's. They're both in the genus Melanerpes, so they have very similar calls and aggressive nature. But these guys live in large family groups, which is very unique among our woodpeckers here in North America. They eat and store acorns, and they also fly catch for insects like Lewis's woodpeckers do. And as I mentioned, Klickitat County, the hotspot in Washington. So I'll play some of their vocalizations for you. They sound like they're laughing. And I think their call goes beautifully with their clown-like appearance. And here's another example of some other vocalizations. Okay, so as I mentioned, these guys are uniquely plumaged. They kind of look like clowns to me. They have this kind of really unique white face with black feathering around the base of the bill. The males have red across the entire top of their head, down and across the back of their head, whereas the females, the red stops just before the eye, like it does in the pileated woodpecker. So if you see a small red spot that doesn't extend to the white part of the face, that's a female. If the red goes all the way to the white part of the face, it's a male. Both sexes have this white eye, and none of the other woodpeckers in our area have a bright white eye like that. They have this kind of black necklace that goes across their breast, and it kind of has a little streaking that goes down into the white belly. Like the Lewis's, their back is jet black with sort of an iridescent kind of greenish sheen to it. And unlike the Lewis's, they have a white wing patch that's very visible in flight, and you can just barely see it here on this bird perched on the left. And as I mentioned, they store acorns in usually a really old, large diameter tree. So they drill a hole for the acorn. They'll go grab an acorn. They'll come back. They'll try to fit the acorn in there, and they'll adjust the hole to fit the size of the acorn. And these are called granary trees, and they are highly defended against. So the family group will defend them from other acorn woodpeckers, as well as Lewis's woodpeckers, squirrels, anything that might try to steal those acorns. They're heavily defended. So kind of a unique characteristic, and something, if you see an acorn stuck in a tree and there's a bunch of them in there, you know there's acorn woodpeckers around.
Where are granary trees?
Where are they? Or
where are they? Are they a specific type?
No, they could be any kind of tree species. Most of the ones I've seen have been in conifers and pine, but where that's absent, like if it's just pure oak, it'll just be in a dead oak tree usually. Yep.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so that's those are all the true woodpeckers, I guess you want to say. Now we're going to move into the 3 species of sapsuckers that are found here in Washington. So I'll start out with the red-naped first. So they're mostly associated with aspen groves, but you can also find them in conifer forest. They primarily eat sap, ants, and they will also fly catch for insects. These guys are mostly quiet. They usually don't dig for insects, but you can hear them excavating their sap wells in trees. And they have an irregular drum pattern, which I'll play in a second. And they are migratory. Most of our sapsuckers leave Washington except for the red-breasted. So here I'll play some calls. To me, it kind of sounds whiny, or kind of like a cat call, sort of a little bit like a catbird. And this next one. That one's usually given during a disturbance or a territorial encounter. And then the last one I'll play is the drumming. And you can tell, and this is what I mean by the irregular pattern. You can see how it kind of trails off at the end with just 1 or 2 notes. It's not a solid drum pattern like the hairy woodpecker that I played earlier. So all 3 sapsuckers drum that way. They kind of peter out at the end. It can be really hard to tell them apart by their drum. So this is the only drum I'm playing is for the red-naped. Okay, so as their name implies, they have a red spot at the very back on the back of their head or their nape. So they have the red on top of the head, then there'll be a black band, and then there'll be a little red patch below that. That's the nape area. Both males and females have a completely red on top of the head, and the males have a completely red throat. And the only way to really tell a male from a female is that the females have a white chin. So you can see that the red under the throat stops just before the base of the bill, and there's a little white area on the chin. So that's how you can tell a female from a male. On a male, that would be all completely red. They have black wings with a pretty large white kind of what I call the shoulder spot that's easily visible when they're perched. They do have a black band across their breast, kind of like how a flicker has. And they do have white down the middle of their black back, but it's usually messy and interspersed with other black feathers. It's not a pure white stripe like on a downy or a hairy woodpecker. And it's not visible in any of these photos, but there is a little bit of yellow on the belly between the legs on these guys, kind of like a yellow-bellied sapsucker has. But it's just not visible in these photos. And here's an example of what their sap wells look like. So remember I was telling you that they look different from the sap wells that a white-headed woodpecker would make. And here you can see that they do resemble kind of like a grid pattern, and they're excavated in squares or long vertical rather than horizontal rows. These guys really do like to make sap wells in aspen, but they also will eat the sap of ponderosa pine and Douglas fir. So next we'll move on to the red-breasted sapsucker. Now this is the one you guys have over on the west side, and we get occasionally here on the east side in certain areas. So these guys like both deciduous and conifer forests. You can find them in both. And here on the east side, we usually find them associated with aspen during the breeding season. These guys are loud and aggressive. during the breeding season. You can usually tell they're around because they're fairly vocal. And from what I understand, they're an elevational migrant. So the birds that are nesting up higher in the mountains, like in the Cascades, when winters are really hard and there's a lot of snow, we often see a little influx of them into lower elevations on both the west and east side of the mountains. As I mentioned, they're mostly on the west side of the Cascades, and they can be more common at lower elevations. And where the ranges overlap, they do hybridize with red-naped sapsuckers. And I've documented that over here, just west of Yakama in an area called the Autanum, where there's quite a few aspen groves. And I've actually documented a red-breasted sapsucker nesting with a red-naped sapsucker there. And we often see hybrid red-breasted, red-naped offspring here along the eastern slope of the Cascades, and also sometimes here in the winter in the valley. So I'll play their vocalizations. They're very similar to a red nape. They sound very similar. There's just a slight difference. And I'll play their other call here. So you can tell they do sound very similar to red nape, which is probably why they hybridize so readily here in the Cascades where the ranges overlap. So as their name implies, the red from their heads extend all the way down their throat into the breast area, which you don't see in the other sapsuckers. As I said, the red under the throat, red on top of the head, and also on the side of the face. They have that same kind of white shoulder patch that the red-naped has, and the same kind of black and white markings down the middle of the back. And it's kind of visible here, but it's hard to see. They also have a little bit of a yellow wash under the belly, like the red-naped sapsucker does as well. So superficially, from the head down, they look almost identical to a red-naped. They just have a lot more red on the head, throat, and breast compared to the red-naped sapsucker. And there's a little bit of white you can see between the red on the head and the top of the bill. And that can vary in the amount of white that's visible there and also the amount of black. But it's often prominent, like in this bird here. And not that I'm leaving it to last, but one of my other favorite woodpeckers would be the Williamson sapsucker. They also like aspen as well as pure conifer, and they are migratory. So they're almost all gone from here in the wintertime. Usually by November, we don't see any more Williamsons here, but sometimes a few do linger. They're loud and aggressive, and during the breeding season and leading up to the breeding season, especially when the birds first arrive from their migration north, if there's Williamsons around, you usually hear them because they are very loud. They have the same irregular drum pattern that the other sapsuckers have. And the best thing about it is nothing looks like them. But these guys are more common at higher elevations, usually 3,000 feet or higher in the Cascades of Washington. So interesting about this species here, and you've probably heard this, when they were first discovered, they actually thought that the male and the female were separate species because they looked so different. And of all our woodpeckers in North America, they're the most sexually dimorphic, meaning the males and females look the most dissimilar. And it wasn't until somebody found a nest and saw the male and female, saw these two birds going in and out of a cavity, that they realized that they were the same species. So kind of an interesting story about kind of originally how they were discovered. But I'll play their vocalizations, which are kind of obnoxious, I think, but So that's a call that's usually given by the male, and it's usually in the spring during territorial encounters, and it does carry for quite a distance. I'll play that just one more time real quick. And the second call is what we call their chirr call. It's usually an agitation call, or it's usually made around the nest cavity or the nest tree when there's a disturbance. So let's start with the male first. The males have a very unique facial pattern. They have an almost entirely black head with two white lines that extend from the bill and the eye, one from the bill and one from the eye. So they kind of almost have like a zebra stripe pattern on their face. The males have a bright yellow belly. It's much more reduced yellow in the female. They have this prominent white shoulder patch, which is much more defined than either the red-breasted or red-naped. It's much whiter. And the males have this bright red throat patch on an otherwise black neck and chest. The female, on the other hand, is generally this overall pale tawny colored, tawny brown on the head and throughout the body. But it's got black barring across the back and through the flight feathers. So it kind of gives this kind of mottled appearance across their whole back and their belly and their side, their flank. So in conclusion, let's talk a little bit about habitat requirements for all these woodpeckers. So what do all woodpeckers need? Well, woodpeckers need dead trees, and we call these snags, and they use them for both foraging and nesting to varying degrees depending on the species. But every single one needs snags for nesting in order to excavate a cavity, because most of them can excavate easier into dead wood. And they select snags with soft interiors that's caused by wood decaying fungi. So fungi get into the dead wood or into a recently killed tree. The fungi releases enzymes which break down the lignins and the building blocks of the wood tissue, making it softer in order for woodpeckers to excavate. And you really can't tell a good snag just by looking at it. One of my colleagues did a study looking at, she sampled wood hardness and wood characteristics in around woodpecker nest cavities and also in snags that the woodpeckers didn't use. And in Eastern Washington, she calculated that less than 20% of snags are usable at any one time on the landscape for cavity excavation, because they are either too hard, they're too soft, they're too recently dead. So not every snag is created equal, and you can't tell if a snag is usable by a woodpecker for nesting just by looking at it. So the more snags we have on the landscape, the better it is for woodpecker populations, because there's more options and more selection of substrates for them to nest in. So snag conservation is critical, and higher densities of snags should be provided for woodpeckers than is currently recommended. So I work in the forestry realm. I review forest practice applications, which are submitted by individuals who want to harvest timber. And so I review those forest practice applications within my work area along the east slope of the Cascades. So basically within 5 counties that the Yakama Nation has their usual and accustomed rights to. So anytime anybody wants to cut timber, whether it be state DNR, whether it be Weyerhaeuser, whether it be John Smith, who has 10 acres of property, they have to submit a forest practice application. And if it's within my review area, I look at those applications and I can go out into the field and review those on the ground if needed, if it's okay with the landowner. And so one of the things I do is I make recommendations on habitat for cavity nesting birds. But in the forest practice rules that regulates what needs to be left after a timber harvest, they only require that 2 wildlife reserve trees, or what we call WERTs, are to be left per acre. That's all a landowner is required to leave for wildlife. Even though woodpecker diversity on the east slope of the Cascades is greater than on the western side of the Cascades, where the requirement is 3 wildlife recruitment trees or reserve trees per acre. And those don't even, and in most cases, aren't dead trees, because they're not required to leave a dead tree because of L&I standards for safety, which I can understand. So all they have to be are live trees with some defect. And so when I'm out there, I'm working with landowners trying to get like maybe patches of snags cordoned off or retained, just trying to create and leave more habitat post-harvest for cavity nesting species, because they benefit the forest by the ecosystem services they provide. But I think our rules are fairly inadequate here in Washington for making sure that those characteristics are retained during a harvest. And there's no requirement to mark snags for retention because of safety concerns. And landowners aren't required to create snags or WERTs if they don't have them on their property. And so one of the things I do is I work with landowners and say, hey, can you, if you're using an automated or a machine for harvesting trees, something called a feller buncher, can you raise that feller buncher up maybe 10 or 12 feet and snip a tree that way and leave that bottom high stump or short snag for wildlife? And that's one of the kind of win-win situations for foresters and for landowners and for me as a biologist, because a lot of times those trees that they do that on have some sort of defect in the base of the tree, and it's just going to end up in a log pile anyway. So that's kind of one of the things I do, aside from talking to Audubon groups and things like that, is working out in the forest trying to preserve more habitat for cavity nesting species. So preach about the importance of dead trees. A lot of landowners and a lot of people, they're like, oh, dead trees, they don't matter. They're dead. We're just going to cut them down. We want to grow trees. But they're really, really important, especially for woodpeckers and all the species that rely on those cavities woodpeckers make. So with that, I will end it and take any questions.
That's great, Jeff. It was a wonderful presentation. There are lots of questions in this.
Oh, good. Okay.
So, let's see. Are male and female beaks the same?
Yes. Yep. There are subtle differences between males and females. For instance, the white-headed woodpecker, because I work with them for so long and I've banded so many, males generally are a few grams heavier statistically. So they're a little bit larger bodied. Their wings are a little bit longer statistically, and their beaks are a little bit longer statistically than a female. But it doesn't really, there's such small differences, even though they are statistically, it probably doesn't matter much in their day-to-day foraging, excavating ability or anything like that. So
okay, all right.
Males tend to be a little bit bigger.
Yeah. Okay. Mary Holland wants to know if there is more about the shape of a woodpecker cavity that you can explain.
Yes. So the shape of the cavity really depends on the size of the woodpecker. So for instance, for a white-headed woodpecker, for instance, it may go down inside the tree from where the hole is, maybe 10 to 12 inches. And it's usually fairly narrow, like that picture that I showed of the chicks and the egg inside the cavity of those white-headed. It's a pretty small area in there. So it's not very big around, but it's much deeper than it is wide, if that makes any sense. And that size changes based on the size of the woodpecker. So a flicker cavity would be a little bit bigger than would be considerably bigger than a white-headed cavity, and a pileated would be much even bigger. So the size of the woodpecker dictates the size of the tree that they need in order to excavate a cavity.
Is the ceiling any higher than the hole? Does it, the ceiling rise?
No, nope. Usually it's where the hole starts, the cavity goes straight down from there. So it goes in deep enough to allow the bird access to the hole, but then it just goes straight down. There is no up part of the cavity. Yep.
Okay. Lots of comments about a great presentation, I'll tell you that. Let's
Oh,
see.
thank you. I'm glad you all enjoyed it.
I asked that one. What are the sizes of each woodpecker relative to each other?
Okay. Well, the Downey's the smallest, and size-wise, next up would probably be an American three-toed, and the sapsuckers. They're all kind of about the same size. And then the hairy, black-backed, acorn are a little bit bigger, and white-headed are all about the same size. And then Lewis is a little bit bigger than them. And then you got the flicker, and then you got the pileated at the top. So that's sort of the size differential.
Okay. Let's see. Okay. Do any of the woodpecker species have call variations or dialects when they have been separated geographically? I've heard sparrow songs differ by region.
Right. And I have not heard that for woodpeckers. I've heard that for especially for like our songbirds, and that where they've been isolated geographically, or you have subpopulations in areas, they can have different dialects to their vocalizations. But for instance, I mean, a hairy woodpecker here may sound a little different than a hairy woodpecker in New York, but a hairy woodpecker in, say, Bremerton probably doesn't sound any different from one that's in Spokane, if that kind of makes sense.
It does. Thank you.
Yep.
Sarah Schmidt said that she knows that it's been said that Woody Woodpecker is the model for it, but she found an interesting article by Julie Zickafoos, which said that it's possible that it came from the acorn rather than the pileated.
Oh, okay. Now I can see the vocalization coming from the acorn for
Yeah.
sure.
I put the link in the chat. It's an amusing article, and it turns out that in his biography, the animator that created Woody Woodpecker said it was an acorn woodpecker that originally inspired the character. And Julie points out, but it looks like a pileated woodpecker. So
Yes.
Right. Well, thank you for that. Yeah, I did not know that. See, everybody learns something new. See?
Yeah, that's right. Will any woodpeckers use nesting boxes?
Yes, and the one that does it most frequently, from what I understand, is the Lewis's, and they've actually started using that for conservation of the species. There was some work done in Oregon where they were putting up nest boxes for Lewis's, and they found that they were having birds check out the boxes, but they weren't having any of them nest. And so what they ended up doing is they ended up taking bark off a ponderosa pine and putting it on the front of the birdhouse below the entrance hole. And they had usage of the boxes go up almost 2 or 3 fold when they started doing that. Lewis's are probably one of the species that will most often use an old cavity for nesting. As I said, they're the most unwoodpecker-like, so they don't like to excavate their own usually. So for them, nest boxes can be a very good conservation tool. Flickers will also use them fairly routinely. And that's another species that I've found in my work that will routinely use old cavities that exist on the landscape. But for most of the other woodpeckers here in Washington, they really need to excavate the cavity as part of the courtship process. And so a pair gets together, they decide on where the cavity is going to go. The male starts the excavation, the female takes some of that process. So it's a pair bonding experience for the birds. And and I believe that's why they just don't reuse old cavities, because they almost always excavate a new cavity every year. But the exceptions to those are the flicker and the Lewis's. They will reuse, and they will use boxes. Yep.
Great. Somebody said, can't you increase the WRT requirement?
I wish I could.
That's
You know, there's a forest practice board that's governed by the state. They determine the rules that go into there. Those rules were established when the forest practices rules were first set up. And it's a really hard process to get them changed, unfortunately. And so for me, it's easier to work with landowners, work with the agencies, and trying to get them to voluntarily, provide more habitat for cavity nesting species. And I also work with other wildlife. I do a lot with western gray squirrels, northern spotted owl habitat, goshawk habitat, things like that. So it's not just cavity nesters, but in the forest practice regulations, one of the few wildlife related regulations pertains to these wildlife reserve trees specifically for cavity nesters. So I make that a point of making sure that at least the minimums are being met. And a lot of especially the bigger agencies and stuff will do a little bit more for providing habitat, and it's all on a case-by-case basis. It all depends on the type of timber sale. It all depends on where the harvest is happening, and so it's a big complicated issue, unfortunately.
okay. Somebody asked if they mate for life.
Well, let me put it this way. Over the last 10 or so years, I've had a color banding study on white-headeds where I catch the males and females, I put color bands on them. I know which birds are mated or paired when I band them because I can tell males and females apart by plumage. So if I catch a pair together, like at a nest cavity, I give them the same color band combination. Those birds will stay together as long as they're alive. But if, say, I go out in the spring, like say I go out this spring and I go to where my banded birds are, I find a banded male, but all of a sudden I find an unbanded female where there was a banded female last year. Well, that female probably died and a new female moved in. So if the pair is there on the same territory and they're alive, they stay together. But if one of them perishes, it's immediately replaced by another one. So, yep.
Thank you. In California, acorn woodpeckers will establish granaries on almost any tree, including palm trees and power poles.
Okay, there you go. Yep. Whatever's available, I'm guessing.
Is there a range of heights above ground where the nest holes are generally found?
Yes, and it really depends on a lot of different factors. It depends on the size of the woodpecker that's excavating the cavity. It depends on the decay of that tree. It depends on where the decay is in the tree. So sometimes it may be higher, sometimes it might be lower. Now because I've studied white-headeds for so long, I've had them nest as close as to 1.5 feet from the ground. And I've also had them nest as high as probably 35 feet in the air. So it can be highly variable. But for the most part, on average, it's probably between 10 and 25 feet, usually high, with a lot of variability.
Right. Let's see. With the northern flickers, the red markings on the face, are they on the males only? Plus, I noticed that they can be different from another. I had 6 flickers and the red marks were different shapes, sizes, and different places on the heads.
Oh, okay. Yeah, the males are the only ones that have the malar stripe. And on a red shafted flicker, that malar stripe is red. On a yellow shafted flicker, that malar stripe is black. And on intergrades, you can have varying degrees of how much red shows, how much black shows. So that may be explaining some of that difference that you're seeing in what's displayed, why the malar stripes look so different. That's what I'm guessing. Because on say on a pure red shafted flicker, if it has a red malar stripe, it's going to be the same on all males that are red shafted flickers. But if there's an intergrade, that red mallard stripe can be skinnier, it could be thicker. It just depends.
Okay. Unless somebody else has another question, that's all the questions that were in the chat. I have taken you off of share screen so that
Okay.
we can see everybody, and that way then they can clap for you in some way and let you know how much they appreciate it. This was absolutely marvelous. It was great, 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 great.
Well, thank you.
I liked it very, very much. I found it very helpful.
Well, that's wonderful. Yep. They're
so,
my favorite group of birds, so I don't mind talking about them.
Well, I'm glad of that. Let's see. Let me see if I can get them all on here. Okay, everybody clap if you appreciated it and everything else. That was really wonderful.
Well,
And
thank you.
I will send you all the comments that came from people because they said different things, and I want you to know how much you were appreciated. Thank
Well,
you.
thank you very much.
Thank you. And I think that's it for now. And bye, everybody. Thank
All
you
right.
for being here tonight. And thank you for helping Jeff out.
Yep. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Good night,
Okay.
everybody.
Thank you so much.
Yep.
All
Good night.
right. Good night.